people are doing? So, this comparison. So, here's the deal about this one. The OnePlus 13, it's not technically a flagship, or it isn't priced as a flagship, it's priced as a flagship killer, less than the Vivo X200 Pro. Now, I'm more than certain that quite a few of you guys will be commenting about the fact that we should do this comparison between the Vivo X200, the regular one, and the OnePlus 13. That would be fair. And I agree. But the fact is, I don't have the X200. I only have the X200 Pro because, I've got a budget to maintain. And secondly, it should be pretty obvious that the OnePlus 13, if it can keep up, even slightly, with the X200 Pro, then for the price, it's doing a bloody good job. It should be like a blockbuster, shouldn't it? And I think I don't need to mention that over and over, right? For the price is doing well. That statement, I'm not really going to bother with that. I think it should be a given at this point, especially for a comparison like this. Obviously, if the OnePlus is keeping up, then that's fantastic in and of itself. It doesn't really need to beat the X200 Pro. Just want to get that out there. But with that said, let's get started because there's definitely some interesting things going on. Alright, so kicking things off with the regular main camera daylight shots. And here's the thing, the X200 Pro has inherently a lot of options. We have these as natural colors, we have the textured mode, which is super high contrast, super high clarity. It looks beautiful under the right circumstances. Then you also have vivid colors if you don't want natural or slightly desaturated colors. If you want good vibrance, then yes, you have the option for that as well. The OnePlus, on the other hand, it has these options, but I don't think it really works all that well because in my experience, the OnePlus's color modes are just not that good and not that consistent. The regular color profile is fairly nice, as you can probably tell, but it does go for a pretty regular and natural color profile, similar to Zeiss's natural colors on the X200 Pro. Just so you know, we don't really have the same level of flexibility as the Vivo here. But one thing that I'm noticing and really liking about the X200 Pro is that quite simply, the X200 Pro has just a lot of good contrast and exposure balance going on. It's something that Vivo has been refining for ages, and I think this is the culmination of really good exposure and contrast balance, and that's not something the OnePlus does quite as well. It's good, it's close, but it's not quite as natural. It looks kind of processed, kind of like the HDR is taking over and is boosting the shadows, handling the highlights a lot, and just overall giving you a slightly flatter, slightly safer image. It does end up working a little bit better on the X200 Pro, and especially when it comes to skin tones, I have noticed that the X200 Pro is far more natural with those. Like the OnePlus will kind of whiten you up a lot, especially if you're taking regular main camera shots with human subjects. It will have a tendency to give you a really flat result, which I'm not the biggest fan of. And even with the dynamic range test, it takes a very similar approach, as you can tell. It allows the highlight to be a little bit more blown out, but instead goes for a lot more shadow detail, as opposed to the X200 Pro, which takes the opposite approach. Now personally, I kind of like the X200 Pro a little bit better, but in this particular instance, I would say you could go either way. But for all the other shots, I have a feeling that most people will actually prefer the X200's approach. But then for the ultrawide camera, there are once again a couple things to bear in mind. So first and foremost, the OnePlus actually has a wider field of view, which is a really good thing because I think one of my pet peeves with the X200 Pro's ultrawide camera is that it just doesn't feel wide enough. It's unfortunate. It's not going to affect you on a regular basis for your regular photos, but comparatively speaking, it definitely feels very obvious that, at least in a comparison, it feels very obvious that the OnePlus is much wider. And the contrast balance is much better on the OnePlus 13 as opposed to its main camera performance right there, which is kind of odd that the OnePlus can give you such natural and such nice looking shots that are very similar to what the Vivo is doing with the ultrawide camera, but it doesn't really go for that natural approach with the main camera. Kind of unfortunate, at least for my taste. Once again, a lot of this is based on personal taste, so you guys are just gonna have to figure out which one you prefer. Having said that, there are inconsistencies here and there. I had one little problem right here with the OnePlus 13. As you can tell, it completely crushed the shadows. It's like either you have too much HDR or you have none at all. So I think overall, even though I'm not the biggest fan of the main camera on the OnePlus 13, I really like the approach on the ultra-wide camera. Not only does it have a wider field of view, but it just also maintains really nice contrast. Very similar to the X200 Pro, which I already like. At this point, that should be obvious, right? But yeah, the OnePlus 13 is super close when it comes to the ultra-wide camera. Now then, macro photography. So both of these phones can actually provide really good telephoto macros. Now, unfortunately, even though the OnePlus 13 does appear to be capable of getting a little bit closer to the subject, I am seeing a good bit more grain, and the overall sharpening and processing seems a little bit more prevalent. It's a little bit more obvious when you look at it, but it does get much worse when you go for the sensor crops on both. Now, on the X200 Pro, this was like a novelty feature that works exceptionally well. And even right now, as you can tell, it works immensely well, even with a 7.4x overall zoom, which means a 2x sensor crop on top of a 3.7x telephoto zoom. It looks exceptional. It looks basically optical zoom quality. The details are beautifully preserved. There's no over sharpening, no artifacts, no grain, no noise. It's basically perfect. And on the OnePlus 13, even though yes, it can get a little bit closer, the 3x telephoto camera, I'm not sure if it's a sensor problem or it's a processing problem that's not taking advantage of the sensor. Whatever the case, the end result is just not quite as good, quite as naturally beautifully detailed as the X200 Pro. Now, speaking of sensor crops, let's check out the details with the 2x sensor crop from the main camera. Now, notice something. Before we crop in or say anything else, notice the lights on the bridge. It would appear that they somehow look like they're turned off on the OnePlus 13. But then take a look at the reflection on both. It appears that the OnePlus 13 has a reflection of the lights, but not the lights themselves. Spooky, is it not? Well, actually, I figured it out. It was probably because I had noticed that there was a little flicker when I took the shot, and I think by some ungodly timing, I managed to take this shot exactly when the flicker was happening, and it somehow just basically flickered the lights off on the OnePlus 13, but the reflection still stayed. So yeah, bloody interesting how the shot turned out. Now, cropping all the way in, I do want to give you guys some context here. So I did two other comparisons with the X200 Pro. One was against the Vivo X200 Ultra, the previous generation flagship, and also the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. Now, both of those have definitively much better, much higher quality, larger sensors as opposed to the X200 Pro. So bearing that in mind, the X200's 2x sensor crop was not quite as good. You can check out those comparisons for yourself. The 2x sensor crop on the X200 Pro is not nearly as good as those two phones. So comparatively speaking, the OnePlus 13, it appears that its detail preservation with 2x sensor crop is non-existent. Like, it's really bad. This is horrible for a 2025 flagship killer. Like, yeah, sure, it's a flagship killer, but that's no excuse for this level of quality. Or the lack thereof with 2x sensor crop. Anyways, let's check out 3x. Of course, it is 3.7x on the X200 Pro, hence a slightly larger crop, but it's almost negligible. And well, let's crop into 500% and see which one of these has better details. Now, as you would have probably guessed, and it should have been obvious, especially if you saw the macro shots, that the X200 Pro is definitely producing a much better image. It's just got a little bit more contrast, which is really helping with the details, as you can probably tell. But even the overall processing, the sharpening that's happening on the X200, it feels a lot more natural and less overprocessed as opposed to the OnePlus. The processing is there. It is definitely obvious, especially if you're cropping into 500%, it's going to be present. But it is less obvious. However, what about 6x? So the OnePlus 13's UI, the camera UI, kind of pushes you to go for a 6x, which is essentially, supposed to be at least, a 2x sensor crop on top of the 3x telephoto camera. Now, having said that, the 3x quality isn't quite as good as you would really hope, especially for a smartphone that is trying to push you towards a 6x, nudge you towards using a 2x sensor crop. Now, I kind of like the fact that the OnePlus is toning down on the processing. The X200 Pro, on the other hand, it does have the processing, and obviously we are cropping in a whole lot now, but I still think the sheer amount of detail on the X200 Pro, even with the overprocessing that we can see, I still believe it takes a win in this particular case, because the sheer lack of detail on the OnePlus, it doesn't even stand a chance at this point. But of course, people's threshold for overprocessing can vary a lot. And this is where the 10x comes in, because 10x is particularly interesting when it comes to the X200 Pro. So up until now, yes, we saw a certain degree of processing happening, but at 10x, it would appear that the X200 Pro really likes to go overboard. And that's a problem. Because once again, with a 500% crop, you can tell it's too much. There's way too much processing going on. The OnePlus 13, it's just not even bothering with all that much processing. It has a little bit of grain in there, but overall it actually looks nicer, more natural, more pleasing. But of course, speaking of details, we can't just go ahead without the high res, right? So this is of course with the main cameras. Now I'm gonna give you a little prediction. I haven't seen this yet, but I do believe that the Vivo will pull ahead simply because we saw just how much of a difference the 2x sensor crop made. And well, okay, it's a very small difference, but yes, the Vivo is still pulling ahead. It does have more detail as opposed to the OnePlus 13, but I expected a larger difference because the 2x sensor crop difference was massive, to say the very least. With the high res, it would appear that the difference is not quite as ridiculous. Anyway, let's move on to the ultra-wide camera. Now, there is something I want to point out. In this case, you might once again feel like the OnePlus is kind of crushing some of the shadows, especially in the trees. But I think that's actually a very nice and natural approach. It looks far more processed and far more HDR-esque on the X200 Pro, which may not be the taste for everyone. It's not for me at the very least. And I know I'm not alone out here. And of course, cropping in, my stance is very similar. Yes, it looks very nice on both. Sure, it looks very similarly detailed on both, once again. But just take a look at the lights and the way everything is being processed on the X200 Pro. It just looks like there's artifacts around every single bit of lighting that we have here. And that just makes it look kind of unnatural. But then of course the telephoto high-res, see this I feel is very important because the Vivo X200 Pro might quite possibly have one of the best telephoto cameras this year. We have both a 50 megapixel and a 200 megapixel mode on the X200 Pro, so let's crop in and check out how well the OnePlus can keep up here. So cropping into 500%, it is fairly obvious that the OnePlus 13 is not that bad, especially if you're just looking at the duck. But take a look at the water around it. The sheer level of artifacting that we have on the OnePlus 13, it is quite something. Comparatively, the X200 Pro, even under fairly challenging lighting, like I'm pretty sure it took the shot almost after sunset, so there was not a lot of light to go around with, and it is still producing a beautiful shot, very less processing and artifacting going on, which is quite something. Then of course, 200 megapixels. Now this is where it's going to be very challenging for the X200 Pro because as you can probably tell, for a 200 megapixel shot, you need a good amount of light, and I'm telling you right now, we did not have a good amount of light. It was a fairly nice amount of light, good enough for regular 12 megapixel shots, maybe even 50 megapixel shots, but using the telephoto camera and the 200 megapixel mode, that's gotta be challenging, right? Well, guess what? Not quite as much for the X200 Pro because once again, the sheer level of detail that we have and the sheer absence of artifacting, that's what's surprising me here because I would think that we would either have an arseload of grain or a whole bunch of noise reduction and processing artifacts happening, but neither of those are quite as evident. There's definitely some going on, like especially right in front of our duck over here. You can kind of tell that there's a bit of artifacting, bit of smoothing artifacts on the X200 Pro, but that's a whole bunch of pixel peeping. And comparatively, the OnePlus 13 just is chock full of artifacts, and there's not much we can do about that, now can we? But of course, look, it was kind of expected that the X200 would pull ahead. It is kind of a specialty for the X200 with its telephoto camera that we have here. Now, when it comes to the selfie camera, it's kind of interesting. So the OnePlus 13 is good. It's got a wider field of view, which I appreciate a lot. I prefer my selfie cameras to be as wide as possible, so my face is as far as possible from the camera, well, technically speaking. But, well, the point is this. I don't mind how the OnePlus looks, especially how it can handle the contrast with the background, but as you can probably tell, with the way the OnePlus 13 processes the images, it will make a complete cutout of the bloody subject and then brighten it up. Like, damn, the cutout is so obvious when you look at it. It just, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's that kind of a situation here. It's like one of those shoddy Photoshop works by someone who doesn't really know how to use Photoshop. It's kind of a situation like that. It's very obvious that I'm being cut out over here. The Vivo, on the other hand, actually, it maintains good contrast on me as a subject, but I do think that the contrast in the background is not quite as nice. But yeah, overall, I would still say that the X200 looks much more natural, much more like a regular selfie as opposed to a photoshopped selfie on the OnePlus 13. But then, oddly enough, with the portrait selfies, it actually looks pretty good on the OnePlus 13. Not quite as much contrast, not quite as much depth in the colors that I would personally like, because as you can tell, the t-shirt just looks completely washed out on the OnePlus as opposed to Vivo, which is maybe oversaturating as well to a certain extent, but it is much closer to the natural navy blue color that I had. Now, having said that, it does look a lot more natural on the OnePlus as opposed to regular selfies, which I think it's probably because you anyways need a good cutout when you're basically processing a portrait selfie, because you need to blur out the background. So maybe because of that, because we're expecting a cutout, it doesn't look as obvious or as jarring as we saw with the regular selfies. At least that's my hypothesis here. Now, when it comes to rear camera portraits, I can confidently say that both of these phones can perform tremendously, but here's the thing, the OnePlus 13 can nail the basics. It can give you good edge detection, good skin tones, fairly good contrast, so on and so forth. I still prefer the slightly high contrast and the slightly generally lower exposure that we get on the X200 Pro. It looks a little bit more natural, but the reason I feel the X200 is probably gonna take over and take a lead here is simply because it has so many more options. Not only do you get more focal lengths like the 35mm shots and the 135mm shot, which both of them work near flawlessly even though they are kind of relying on digital crops, the processing is more than capable enough of handling these situations really bloody well. But we also get about 100 different options when it comes to portrait mode presets, whether it's with the colors or the background bokeh, and let me tell you, all of these look very natural. They feel realistic, they look very realistic. Stylized, of course, that's kind of the point. For someone who is really interested in photography, especially portrait photography, well, it's gonna grab their attention, that's for damn sure. Now, when it comes to rear camera night mode, now this is gonna be a little bit more interesting. So, as you can probably tell, these are kind of more challenging in the fact that they have a lot of crazy lighting going on, crazy colored lighting going on, as opposed to just being dark night mode shots. Now, here's the thing with the X200 Pro. Vivo drastically improved the processing for the night mode. Not that it's improving the quality of the shots, the raw quality, but rather the fact that it looks very natural, very high contrast, very much like a night mode shot. Like you actually took it during night. You can actually look at it and tell that it's taken at night. That used to not be the case for Vivo flagships, believe it or not. I've used plenty of them and I've complained about plenty of them in that regard. It most definitely was not nearly as good as the Vivo X200 Pro. It's one of the reasons I'm still using it, because the night mode is such a pleasure to use. The OnePlus is very close to the X200 Pro. However, it's still not quite as natural or realistic of a night mode as the X200 Pro. It's there, it's almost there, but it definitely goes for a safer approach, lifted shadows, less contrast, and that doesn't look quite as natural or quite as nice, at least not to my eyes, as opposed to the X200 Pro. Now with the ultrawide cameras, actually, just like how we saw in daylight images, is actually not a lot of difference between the OnePlus 13 and the Vivo X200 Pro. It's a very good reason as to why I really like the ultrawide camera in both the daylight and the night mode shots on the OnePlus, but the main camera, not quite as much. Having said that though, I have noticed that the OnePlus does have a bit of a tendency to curb down the saturation, especially of the lights, of the vivid lights that we have in this scene. It's very obvious that the overall saturation is being lowered, and in this scene in particular, for the most part, I actually like how the X200 looks. However, curbing down the saturation can help sometimes, especially because in this particular shot, the blue is going completely overboard on the X200 Pro. Now the background looks nicer, like the green and the red looks really nice on the X200, but the blue is not being balanced nearly well enough. So the OnePlus is actually doing a much better job in that regard. But then of course, zoom at night. Let's start off with the 2x. I'm pretty sure we can guess exactly how this is gonna go. And so, just as expected, it is better on the X200 Pro, but the difference is not as bad as with the daylight shots, which is kind of odd, but it also really goes to show that when the processing is really allowed to take over, the detail preservation does improve a good bit on the OnePlus 13. Because the X200 is good, it's very good, but the OnePlus does appear to have improved quite a lot as opposed to its daylight 2x, where I'm guessing that the processing doesn't do a whole lot much, or it doesn't really do what's necessary to allow the OnePlus's shots to look nice or detailed. But what about the 3x? So we obviously have the 3.7x on the X200 Pro, and let's crop in and see exactly how this goes. I have a feeling once again the X200 might pull ahead. And well, just as you would have guessed, the OnePlus isn't quite performing as well. It's close once again. Like, we are doing a 500% crop on a night mode shot, which I'm not really sure many people are going to want to do, but it does give you a good idea about the differences in the detail preservation between the two, which is again higher on the X200 Pro. Not as massive of a difference as you might have expected, but it's definitely there. And with that, we are at the end of this comparison. So here's the deal. I think the OnePlus 13 is good. It's really good. The fact that it is able to keep up on multiple occasions, the fact that it is nailing the basics is great. But I also believe that yes, even though it is a cheaper flagship, even though for the price it's, punching above its weight class, basically, I still think that if you really want something that is cutting edge for photography, that is probably going to be one of the best for photography at this very moment, at least, the X200 Pro is the way to go, because the way Vivo has refined its processing, and especially the colors, the contrast, the exposure, it's just gotten so much better. That's the best way to put it. It's gotten so much better as opposed to previous generations and previous flagships that it's almost a no-brainer. It does have problems, like with the main sensor. It's not the highest quality sensor that Vivo flagships have had. As weird as that sounds, there's been a downgrade with the main sensor. And there's still certain kinks that need to be handled and smoothened out on the X200 Pro's processing department, especially with the 10x overprocessing and so on and so forth. But still, when everything is put together, the X200 Pro is an absolutely stellar flagship. There's no two ways about that. And for photography, it might just be the best bet. The OnePlus, on the other hand, it's more for people who want a good camera, who want a camera that can perform better than the price of the smartphone. Then yeah, that would be the perfect way to go. That's the best way I can classify these two devices. So with that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, and I'll be seeing you guys soon enough with many more to come. Cheers.